At 5:42 on 28 November 1943, Private Henry Stillwater James lay half-submerged in a flooded drainage culvert east of Edelbruck, Luxembourg, his rifle barrel hovering a hand's width above black, trembling water. The air sat at 38 degrees F, cold enough for each breath to unfurl in a slow, white ribbon. Beneath him, the runoff held at 41 degrees F, numbing everything from his knees down. The smell was a mixture of wet soil, rusted iron, and stagnant autumn decay. Every few seconds, a bead of water slid from the curved concrete overhead and landed on the back of his neck with surgical precision. Henry didn't move. He couldn't, not with the stakes measured in minutes. 146 yards ahead, just beyond a bend in the narrow farm track, an 11-man German MG42 detachment was building the final pieces of a roadblock ambush. Their intended victims, a 4-vehicle American supply convoy moving without escort, rumbling westward on schedule and utterly unaware. The culvert offered concealment but not safety. Its diameter was 32 inches at the widest point. Henry had to turn his head sideways to keep his cheek on the stock of the M1903A4 Springfield. There was no exit behind him, only soft earth and a sheet of ice-ringed mud, and once he opened fire, the Germans would triangulate his position within seconds. He knew it, accepted it, and steadied himself against the shallow current pushing gently at his elbows. A metallic clack carried through the dawn haze. That was the MG42's feed cover being tested. Through the culvert's narrow mouth, Henry watched shapes shifting between the trees, gray coats, hunched shoulders, and half-seen silhouettes sliding in and out of the mist. He counted them again the way a boatwright counts rivets on a keel line. 1, 2, 3, 11. The same number he'd noted an hour earlier, when he first crawled into this watery slit and settled himself on cold stone. 2 riflemen were dragging a small pine trunk across the road, rotating it into place. Another pair crouched behind sandbags, inspecting the firing corridor. An NCO, binoculars hanging heavy against his chest, directed them with economical hand motions. But Henry focused on the MG42 team, the centerpiece of the trap. The weapon rested on its bipod like a predator poised to strike. The assistant gunner fed a 50-round belt through with the reverence of a religious ritual. If they opened up, the convoy would be cut to pieces in under 15 seconds. Henry exhaled, slow and deliberate, letting his breath drift upward until it disappeared into the pre-dawn gloom. He shifted his left hand, feeling the cold slicked oil on the rifle stock. His fingers were stiff, wood-like, but he coaxed them into motion. The Springfield weighed 25 pounds, but after hours in the water it felt heavier, like lifting wet timber on a river dock again. This was the moment he'd been told not to attempt. This was where his so-called Viking Eye-Line Trick earned its derision. He tilted the rifle inward 7, maybe 8 degrees, barely perceptible, but enough for the right edge of the scope body to blur into a soft vertical line. His left eye stayed open, surveying the whole field, tracking lateral drift the way he once tracked drifting river craft from Gunderson Boatworks slipway. He could almost hear the foreman's old voice, read the lines, not the boards. Boats lie, motion doesn't, officers had scoffed. You can't shoot straight with both eyes open. Tilt that rifle again, Private, and I'll have it taken from you. Sniping isn't riverboat superstition. But Henry wasn't aiming for doctrine. He was aiming for survival, his, and that of the men currently rumbling toward this kill zone at 14 miles per hour, their engines already vibrating faintly through the earth beneath him. A drop of water struck the bolt sleeve of his rifle with a muted tink. He ignored it. The NCO stepped forward and raised 2 fingers. The MG42 gunner settled behind the weapon, cheek pressed to the cold receiver. One of the ammo carriers slung the belt over his shoulder for rapid feed. A rifleman lit a cigarette, cupping the flame. The brief flare illuminated the outline of his jaw. Henry inhaled. The water around him rippled with the expansion of his chest. 5 minutes until the convoy rounded the final bend. That was the arithmetic, cold, precise, unforgiving, another hand signal. The Germans fanned out, moving to their trigger positions. The kill zone widened like the opening jaws of a trap. Henry could see the MG42 shift slightly, settling into its final firing angle, an arc perfectly aligned with where the American lead truck's windshield would appear. The culvert suddenly felt smaller, tighter, every muscle in Henry's neck and shoulders locked into readiness. He touched the trigger. The first pressure point took up cleanly. Just ahead, the MG42 gunner pulled back the charging handle. A sharp metallic snick echoed through the morning air. Henry's heartbeat fell into cadence with the steady drip of water against the stone. He centered the NCO first, cut to black. In the next 38 minutes, everything would change, not just for the convoy that hadn't yet seen danger, but for the men who once laughed at a riverboat laborer's strange way of sighting a rifle. In the winter of 1918, the year Henry Stillwater James was born, the St. Croix River froze so thick that men drove horse teams across it as though it were a second road. Locals said you could hear the ice groan at night, deep, whale-like notes rolling through the valley. For the families of the East Side Mill District, those sounds were as familiar as church bells. They lived by the river, worked by the river, and like the river, endured whatever the season demanded. Henry's first memories were of cold, not the soft cold of late autumn, but the knife-edged, skin-stiffening cold of a Minnesota January. Their two-room clapboard house stood barely 300 yards from the water, with thin walls that whistled when the north wind pressed against them. His father, Elias James, would stuff old flour sacks into the window gaps, muttering that someday he'd install real insulation, someday, when millwright wages rose above 40 cents an hour. But wages rarely rose, and so, from age 10, Henry split cordwood behind the house, stacking it against the wall in uneven towers that leaned like exhausted soldiers. The work made his shoulders grow before the rest of him. In school photos, he looked like a wiry farm kid with the calm eyes of someone twice his age. He wasn't talkative, not shy, just quiet. Each evening he lingered by the riverbank, watching boats drift in the slow current, cataloging how they moved. First the bow, then the stern, then the subtle sideways creep of unnoticed wind. No one taught him to observe like this. It simply made sense to him. Motion on the water obeyed rules, you just had to watch long enough to see them. And watching was something Henry James could do longer and more patiently than most. In 1930, still small for his age but broad in the forearms, Henry approached Gunderson Boatworks looking for part-time work. The foreman, a thick-set Norwegian named Leif Gunnarsson, eyed him skeptically. "You handle tools, boy," Henry nodded. "You take orders without talking back." Another nod, Leif grunted. "Then sweep the slipway, don't fall in." For the next 6 years, Henry lived in the world of sawdust, pitch, tar, and the rhythmic tap-tap-tap of mallets setting rivets. The boatworks operated 6 days a week, repairing fishing trawlers and river skiffs battered by ice and time. Henry began with broom and bucket duties, but within months, Leif realized the boy noticed things others: slight warps in hull planking, misaligned frames, the way a keel's string line bowed when someone had made a careless measurement. By 1933, Henry could sight down a 30-foot hull and tell where it would drift if left untied in a crosswind. His sense of motion prediction, reading arcs, angles, invisible lines, became uncanny. It was Leif who planted the first seeds of the technique that would later save an American convoy in Luxembourg. On the old longships, Leif told him one late afternoon, wiping pitch from his hands, sailors kept both eyes open when tracking another vessel. One eye for the world, one eye for the target. They looked through the ship and past it at the same time. Helps you see where something will be, not just where it is. Henry absorbed the lesson silently, replaying it in his mind. Dual line perception, movements as lines, not points, foreseeing instead of reacting. He practiced by watching gulls circle overhead, tracking their drift with both eyes open until their paths became almost predictable. It was here on the river docks, long before the army stamped his ID tags, that the roots of the Viking Eye-Line Trick took hold, though the name wouldn't come until much later, spoken half as a joke by another soldier who didn't really understand it. On the morning of December 7, 1941, Henry was sanding a keel plate under the gray sky of early winter. The cold made every hammer strike ring sharp as a bell. Around noon, a fisherman sprinted down the dock shouting that the Japanese had attacked Pearl Harbor. Leif switched on the small shop radio. Static, then the trembling voice of a national news announcer. Henry didn't speak. He just listened, jaw tight, eyes narrowing as he tried to picture the scene, men scrambling, smoke rising from ships he had never seen. When the report ended, the workshop stood in total silence except for the soft hiss of the radio. Leif looked at him. "You thinking of going?" Henry shrugged. "Feels like the thing to do." And that was that. In January 1942, Henry kissed his mother goodbye at the Stillwater bus stop, promised to write, and rode south to the enlistment station in St. Paul. His father shook his hand instead of hugging him. Elias wasn't good at big displays, but his grip lingered a moment longer than usual. The military processed him with clinical speed. Height, 511, weight, 158 pounds, eyes, gray trades, boat repair, woodwork, machine familiarity, serial, 37,114,622. By mid-January, he was on a troop train heading toward the massive sprawl of Fort Benning for basic training. Fort Benning was loud, hot, and orderly in a way the river had never been. Henry adapted quickly, not because he was naturally military-minded, but because he understood repetition. Boatright work required steady hands, exact movements, and the willingness to do something the same way 100 times until it was perfect. The army admired the results, even if it didn't understand the mindset behind them. He took to the rifles easily. The instructors first handed him the standard M1 Garand, its 8-round clip snapping into place with a metallic ping. Henry liked its sturdiness, its clean recoil, its predictability. But he gravitated even more toward the M1903 Springfield, the bolt-action model used for precision work. On the range, something curious happened. Henry scored average in slow-fire accuracy. But during moving target drills, rare events meant to simulate fleeing or crossing enemies, he consistently hit targets at 200 yards while others struggled to connect at 100. An instructor noticed him tilting the rifle slightly. "Private James," he barked, "your weapon is canted, correct your posture." Henry straightened the rifle, his next shot missed by nearly a foot. "You do that again and I'll take the rifle away," the instructor warned. Henry offered no argument. Confrontation wasn't in his nature. He simply returned to standard posture and blended with the others. But the memory of the tilted rifle stayed with him, waiting for the right moment. By midsummer, Henry was assigned to the 110th Infantry Regiment, 28th Infantry Division, known by friend and foe as the Bloody Bucket due to its red keystone patch and heavy combat reputation. He arrived at Camp Livingston, Louisiana, where the heat clung to everything like wet cloth. He met the men he would fight beside: Corporal Warren Pee Wee McAllister, a 56 bar gunner who swore constantly but shot beautifully; Samuel Rourke, a farm boy radio man from Iowa who carried photographs of tractors more lovingly than most carried images of sweethearts; Arthur Brenner, a motor pool sergeant who gave Henry the nickname Stillwater within minutes of learning his hometown; Lieutenant Howard Gaines, the platoon leader, tall, crisp, by the book, and often dismissive of soldiers who displayed unorthodox habits. Gaines noticed Henry's quiet nature and interpreted it as uncertainty. He noticed Henry's precision and interpreted it as luck. And when Henry tilted his rifle during a rapid movement target drill, Gaines noticed that too. "Straighten that weapon, Private," he said sharply. "This isn't a river dock." Henry obeyed, but that afternoon, during a demonstration of moving targets suspended on wires, Henry struck a swinging steel plate at 250 yards using his dual-eye technique before Gaines could intervene. The shot echoed across the range like a defiant bell. Pee Wee muttered, "Hell, Stillwater, you do that with one of them Viking tricks you river guys talk about." Henry simply said, "Just looked right." Gaines ignored the hit entirely. He didn't want creativity, he wanted regulation. On July 5, 1943, orders arrived. The 28th Division was headed to Europe. The unit assembled on the pier at New York Harbor under a sky smeared with summer haze. Liberty ships loomed above them, gray, smoking, crowded with men and equipment. The night before departure, Henry sat on his bunk rewriting a letter to his parents. He wrote slowly, unsure what to say. He didn't fear the war. He wasn't eager for it either. His handwriting, neat as always, spelled out simple truths. "I'm well. I'll do my job. Don't worry unless someone comes to the door." He folded the letter carefully, as though precision might keep it safe. The Atlantic crossing was long and nauseating. Bunks were stacked 4 high, the air thick with diesel, sweat, and the brine of perpetual damp. Men argued about baseball, played cards, wrote letters, and confided fears they'd never admit aloud back home. Henry kept mostly to himself. He spent hours leaning on the railing, watching how the ship carved through waves and how smaller objects, debris, gulls, patches of foam drifted in its wake. Even here on the open ocean, he studied movement. At night he lay awake listening to the groan of steel plates flexing beneath them. It reminded him of the river ice of his childhood, huge, cold, unpredictable, but carrying them all the same. The division arrived in England in late July, greeted by rain that seemed determined never to stop. Training resumed in fields churned into mud, with British instructors demonstrating lessons learned the hard way since 1939. Here Henry was issued a M1903A4 Springfield with the M73B12, 5x scope. A lieutenant handed it to him with little ceremony, saying, "James, you're steady under pressure. Command wants you trained as a designated marksman, don't let it go to your head." Henry nodded. He never let anything go to his head. The scope, however, frustrated him. Its narrow field of view felt like staring down a tunnel. Target, and though officers still saw him as an odd, quiet river kid with unconventional habits, the enlisted men began to trust him. If Stillwater said a ridge looked wrong, they took the long way around. If he lingered a moment before stepping into a clearing, they paused beside him. He didn't demand respect, he earned it by being consistently, quietly right. By late November 1943, Henry James had everything the Army never knew it needed. The patience of a boatwright, the eyes of a man raised studying movement, a rifle technique the manuals didn't teach, and the humility of someone who had never been praised for anything except hard work. He wasn't celebrated. He wasn't promoted. He wasn't even particularly liked by the officers who valued conformity above creativity. But war does not reward uniformity. War rewards adaptability. And soon, on a cold Luxembourg morning, Henry would be thrust into a moment where no manual, no doctrine, and no superior officer could help him. He would be alone in a flooded culvert, watching an enemy ambush unfold. And everything he had learned in Stillwater, the cold winters, the drifting boats, the lessons from Leif, the subtle tilt of a rifle, would converge into the single moment that would define his quiet, forgotten place in history. By late November of 1943, the war along the Luxembourg border had settled into an uneasy rhythm. American patrols probing forward each dawn, German machine gun teams slipping through the forests like restless shadows, each side testing the other with brief, brutal encounters. But beneath these skirmishes lay a quieter tension, one that no officer briefed and no manual addressed, the creeping realization that American doctrine had not kept pace with German adaptation. And nowhere was this more evident than in the work of the infantry marksmen. The Army's manuals spoke confidently about fixed targets, deliberate fire, prone positions, and the slow, methodical cadence of long-range engagements. But the Germans no longer waited behind fixed lines. Their MG42 teams, mobile and lethal, had learned to shift positions mid-fight, sliding along tree lines, firing from one angle, then reappearing from another before counterfire could settle on them. U.S. doctrine assumed stillness. The Germans offered anything but. The gap between them, between what the book said and what the battlefield demanded, was widening, measured in blood rather than theory. Henry James saw it long before anyone listened. The M1903A4 Springfield was a respectable rifle, accurate enough and sturdy in the hands of a calm soldier. But the scope, the M73B1 with its narrow 2.5x magnification, was a relic of a different era. At 100 yards it revealed a field barely 12 feet wide, at 200 barely 24. Against a static helmet protruding from a trench it was serviceable, but against a German gunner sprinting between trees it was nearly blind. And worse, U.S. doctrine insisted the sniper keep both eyes focused through the sight, body square, posture upright, everything aligned in perfect symmetry. It was a philosophy of precision, not adaptation. Henry felt the flaw each time he trained. When he tried to track a moving silhouette from left to right, the scope's narrow tunnel made the target vanish the moment it strayed outside the crosshairs. By the time he reacquired it, the moment was gone. The threat had moved. But if he tilted the rifle just 7 or 8 degrees and kept his left eye open, the blurred edge of the scope formed a predictive keel line that let him track the motion as smoothly as a drifting river barge. It felt natural, logical, and utterly forbidden. Lieutenant Gaines made that clear the first time he caught Henry practicing it. "Private, straighten that weapon. Don't improvise on army time." Henry obeyed, as he always did. But the flaw remained, festering like a wound, and soon the flaw would cost lives. The first was Private Charles "Red" Mallory, age 22, from Tulsa, Oklahoma. A brawler by nature, but a gentle one, always offering scraps of dried apple from his rations. On a fog-gray afternoon, Red accompanied a reconnaissance patrol near a cluster of abandoned farmhouses. A German MG42 team shifted position behind a low stone wall. Red spotted movement, raised his rifle, and fired, but the gunner was already moving laterally across Red's narrow sight picture. The MG42 barked its terrible metallic roar. Red was dead before he hit the ground. Henry wasn't on that patrol, but he heard the report afterward. The corporal describing it shook his head. Couldn't track the bastard. Moved too fast. The second loss hit closer. Corporal Samuel Rourke, age 24, from Cedar Rapids, Iowa, the radio man who carried photos of tractors like talismans. Rourke was steady, stubborn, always the first to volunteer to carry extra weight on long marches. During a patrol just north of Edelbruck, his squad walked into a shallow ambush. A German gunner shifted positions mid-burst, moving from one tree trunk to another. The U.S. marksman fired and missed. The target vanished behind brush. Rourke dragged a wounded private toward cover. The MG42 found him mid-stride. He died instantly, no final words, no last request, just a sudden collapse under the weight of his own gear. Henry felt something tighten in his chest when he heard, not anger, not yet, but something cold, dense, and immovable. The third was Sergeant Milo Abrams, age 27, Pittsburgh steelworker, a man who had taught Henry how to clean carbon buildup from a rifle chamber using nothing but a bootlace and patience. Abrams led a dusk patrol through a ravine when shots erupted from above. He signaled for covering fire, and the squad's marksman attempted to pin down the MG team, but again, the gunner shifted position. The marksman lost sight in the scope's narrow tunnel. Abrams rose to pull a wounded soldier to safety. The MG42 raked the hillside. Abrams fell face first into the mud. Henry helped carry his body back through the darkening woods. He didn't speak the entire walk. It happened 3 days later. A pre-dawn patrol moved cautiously along the edge of a narrow valley blanketed in low fog. Henry walked forth in the line, his Springfield chilled to the touch, moisture collecting along the edges of the receiver. The world was muted, just the soft crunch of boots in frost and the distant caw of unseen birds. Then a shape flickered on the slope across from them. A German MG42 gunner, half-crouched, sprinting between positions with the belt draped over his shoulder. Henry saw him instantly. Not as a man, but as motion, an arc, a crossing line, an angle of velocity. He raised the rifle, left eye open, tilted slightly. He had the lead, the angle, the timing. The shot was his. "Private James," Lieutenant Gaines hissed. Straight posture, no canting. Henry froze for a fraction of a second, straightened the rifle, looked through the strict, narrow tunnel. The target vanished. He fired anyway, a desperate, futile attempt to salvage the moment. The round struck bark somewhere behind the gunner, and then the MG42 opened. The burst walked across the ground toward them in a rising chain of sparks. Men flattened themselves. Henry dropped behind a tree trunk, heart hammering. When the noise stopped, he heard a soft, wet sound behind him, a body falling, Private Rourke, a neat hole through the chest. Henry stared, unable to process the stillness of a man who had always seemed in motion, always shifting equipment, always adjusting radio dials. Now he was motionless, crumpled in the frost, breathless. Gaines shouted orders. The patrol withdrew. Henry didn't remember the walk back. He remembered only the moment he straightened the rifle against his instinct, the moment the target escaped the scope's narrow vision, the moment Rourke's body fell. He cleaned his rifle that evening with trembling hands, not from fear, but from the dawning realization that obedience had cost a friend his life. The next morning, Henry approached Lieutenant Gaines at the command post tent. "Sir, permission to speak freely." Gaines nodded impatiently. Henry explained the flaw in the Springfield scope for moving targets. He explained the narrow field of view. He described the small tilt, the cant, and how it created a predictive line when combined with both eyes open. He offered simple, quiet logic. Gaines frowned. "Private, doctrine exists to prevent soldiers from inventing foolishness under stress. We don't tilt rifles in the United States Army." A week passed, another patrol ambushed, 2 more wounded. One of them a replacement 19-year-old whose name Henry learned only after writing it on the casualty card tucked into the stretcher's straps. Henry felt the weight settle on him like wet canvas. He wasn't angry at the officers. They were overworked, overwhelmed, tied to doctrine that had been carved in stone long before Europe erupted into fire. They weren't villains. They were simply blind, but blindness in war was fatal. And so Henry returned to what he understood: tools, motion, quiet solutions forged in stillness. Late one evening, with frost creeping across the window panes of an abandoned barn the platoon had commandeered, Henry climbed into the loft with his rifle and a lantern. He laid the Springfield across his knees and waited for the silence to settle. The night before the ambush that would etch his name into unrecorded history, Private Henry Stillwater, James, sat alone behind a half-collapsed barn near the Luxembourg border, the frost tightening across the field like a slowly drawn sheet of glass. The stars overhead were faint, disturbed by drifting haze, and the lantern beside him cast a thin, honey-colored cone of light across the tools of his trade. A cleaning rag, a small carpenter's pencil, and the long, lean shape of the M1903A4 Springfield stretched across his lap. The rifle weighed 25 pounds, but after months of carrying it across Europe, it felt like an extension of Henry's own body, predictable in recoil, patient in its aim, unforgiving of any lapse in discipline. He slid the bolt back, checking the clean rails, then felt for the faint pencil mark he had placed earlier on the right-hand side of the scope housing. A line no longer than a grain of rice, barely visible, but essential. It wasn't a modification, not in any official sense, and certainly not enough to draw an officer's attention. It was simply a reference point, a visual cue for his tilted sight picture. With the rifle canted inward 7 to 9 degrees, the pencil mark aligned perfectly with the blurred edge of the scope body, allowing the keel line to form. This gave Henry what the Army manuals never even considered: a way to track moving targets without losing them in the unforgiving narrowness of the M73B1 optic. Static doctrine had no answer for lateral velocity. Henry's riverborne technique did. He practiced the motion again: tilt, cheek weld, left eye open, right eye through the glass. The lines merged, forming a quiet geometry he had spent years refining without knowing it. Movement was nothing more than drifting water. And drifting water always obeyed rules. A test plate hung from a rope beam groaned in the chilled breeze. Henry pictured it moving, counted the imaginary arc, took a slow breath, then exhaled. Tomorrow the battlefield would demand what doctrine forbade. Dawn after dawn, dusk after dusk, Henry had slipped away from camp to test his technique in silence. When the officers weren't watching, he hung tin cans from tree branches, swung helmets on rope lines, or kicked old mess kit lids down slopes. Anything that moved was a test subject. The process was meticulous. Predict the arc, find the keel line, both eyes open. Lead with the left, commit with the right, fire only when the motion felt right. He missed plenty those first days, but each miss carved another piece of understanding into his memory. He adjusted the rifle tilt by fractions of degrees, refined his cheek weld so that the scope image came to him without hunting, and rewrote his inner calculations of lead, not as numbers but as shapes. Human sprint 1216 FD/sec, crouch walk 46 FD/sec, MG42 crew shift, short, explosive bursts, 1-2 seconds of lateral motion before dropping to prone. He studied the delay between breath and trigger, the subtle sway of his own body in wind, the faint tremor that crept into his arms after hours of stillness. One evening, he attempted a nearly impossible shot. A mess kit lid swinging on a rope at 150 yards, gaining and losing momentum in erratic arcs. Henry tracked it with both eyes open, felt the motion settle into his intuition, and fired. The lid rang clean, then again. And again, 3 hits in a row. From behind him, a voice muttered, "I'll be damned." Henry turned. Pee Wee McAllister stood at the fence line, bar slung across his shoulder, face half-lit by fading sunlight. "Whatever you're doing, Stillwater," Pee Wee said quietly, "don't let the lieutenants see it. They'll ban it before they understand it." Henry nodded once. His technique was ready. At 400 hours, a mission brief whispered through the command tent like a draft. The 110th Infantry Regiment would push a resupply convoy along Route 17, a winding farm track snaking through low Luxembourg hills. Intelligence suggested minimal enemy presence. Henry didn't believe it, not after the last 2 ambushes. "James," the briefing sergeant said, "you'll be overwatch. Find yourself a spot near the road, S-bend, whatever gives you visibility." Well, that was all the instruction he needed. By 4:35, he moved ahead of the convoy, slipping through frost-dusted grass until he found a narrow drainage culvert running beneath the road. The opening was barely 32 inches high, but its angle offered a direct, concealed sightline into the valley below. He tested the water with one hand. Cold as river melt, 41 degrees F, maybe a touch lower, didn't matter. He slid inside inch by inch, letting the water rise to his shins, then knees, then thighs. Every muscle tensed against the shock, but once the cold dulled into numbness, he settled into position. From here, he had an unobstructed field covering everything from 130 to 180 yards across the valley. At 5:35, he heard the first distant rumble of German boots. At 5:41, he saw them, an 11-man MG42 detachment, moving with surgical discipline, assembling the components of a perfect roadblock trap. At 5:42, Henry exhaled slowly, already anticipating the shapes they would take, the arcs their bodies would follow, the fatal geometry he was now prepared to break. The convoy was scheduled to arrive in 6 minutes. He had only one option: stop them alone. The world had narrowed to a single cold breath, held between the moment Henry settled the rifle in the crook of his shoulder and the moment the German NCO raised his hand to initiate final ambush preparations. 5:42:18. Henry's heartbeat slowed. The water dripped rhythmically from the culvert's ceiling. The MG42 gunner knelt behind the bipod checking alignment. The NCO pointed left. Riflemen moved. Pointed right. MP40 flankers repositioned. Pointed forward. MG42 belt loaded. Henry saw their motions not as men but as paths, lines on a map, currents in a river. He found the keel line, tilted the rifle. Both eyes open, moonlight filtered through the gaps in the roof, casting pale lines across the hay-strewn floor. Dust floated in the air like drifting snow. Henry lifted the rifle. He tilted it. Not much, just enough for the blurred right edge of the scope to appear as a pale keel. His left eye remained open, scanning the barn as if it were a drifting field of motion. He saw the arcs again, the predictions. The invisible geometry of movement. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small scrap of paper. On it, he drew the lines he saw when tracking motion, intersecting angles, distance estimations, the faint arc of a running man at 150 yards, the slight dip of downhill movement. They looked nothing like ballistics diagrams. They looked like boat diagrams, currents and drift lines rendered in pencil. Leif Gunnarsson's voice echoed in his memory. Boats lie, motion doesn't. Henry understood it now. Enemy gunners changed positions, but their movement obeyed consistent rhythms, human limitations, terrain angles, inertia. Doctrine didn't account for it, but Henry did. He hung a rusted metal plate from a hay hook, letting it swing freely. He loaded a single round. The barn was cold. His breath hung in the air. He inhaled, tilted the rifle. Both eyes open, predicted the arc, pressed the trigger. The plate rang once, clean, sharp, perfect. Henry lowered the rifle slowly. He knew then that doctrine could no longer dictate his decisions. Permission would never come. Regulation would never save his men, but adaptation might. He would use the Viking Eye-Line trick in combat, repercussions be damned. He would fight the war the way the battlefield demanded, not the way manuals insisted, because war did not forgive hesitation. It did not reward obedience to doctrine when reality demanded something else. And Henry James, the quiet boatwright from Stillwater, Minnesota, was finished waiting for someone to tell him what he already knew. No more deaths because a scope was too narrow. No more failures because movement exceeded regulation. No more obedience when obedience meant loss. He had made his decision. And soon, very soon, the flooded culvert near Edelbruck would test that decision with brutal clarity. Target 1, NCO, 155 yards. Time 05:42:44. Movement. Lateral step to left, steady pace. Light inches. Wind 2 mph crosswind from NW. Henry inhaled, the cold air scraping his throat. The NCO raised his arm for the final signal. The shot cracked inside the culvert, a sharp, claustrophobic thunder. The NCO collapsed before finishing the motion. The German formation faltered instantly. Target 2, MG42 gunner, 146 yards. Time 5:42:49. Movement, leaning forward to charge the handle. Lead minimal downward angle compensation. The gunner froze at the first shot. His hands hovered above the weapon. Henry fired again. The .30-06 round struck just beneath the collarbone, knocking him sideways into the assistant gunner. The MG42 never fired a single round. Target 3, assistant gunner, 149 yards. Time 5:42:54. Movement rising, twisting, reaching for ammo belt. Lead ~4 inches to account for torso pivot. The assistant gunner lunged instinctively toward the MG42. Henry tracked the motion with a fluid glide of the muzzle. Shot 3 broke the man's momentum mid-reach. He dropped across the gun as blood pooled into the frosted grass. Target 4, rifleman 1, 130 yards. Time 5:42:59. Movement sprinting right to left at FT/sec. Lead inches lateral. Henry felt his shoulders tighten against the rifle's wet stock. The blurred edge of the scope drew a perfect keel line over the sprinting soldier. He squeezed. The shot hit mid-torso, dropping the man in full stride. Target 5, MP40 flanker 1, 178 yards. Time 5:43:6. Movement ducking behind tree trunk. Lead vertical rise plus 6-inch lateral. The MP40 gunner tried to flank Henry's imagined position, unaware the shot was coming from below the road. Henry anticipated the pop-out angle. The bullet caught him just as he leaned from cover. Target 6, rifleman 2, 165 yards. Time 05:43:12. Movement. Low crouch walk 4 FD/sec. Lead ~5 inches. The second rifleman scrambled toward the fallen MG42, desperate to revive the ambush. His head bobbed with each step. Henry let the motion synchronize with his own breath. The rifle cracked. The man pitched forward, sliding in the mud. Target 7, MP40 flanker 2, 140 yards. Time 05:43:20. Movement running downslope, angled degrees, accelerating. Lead ~20 inches, downward compensation. This target moved unpredictably, slipping on wet grass, recovering, veering sideways. Most marksmen would lose him after the first misstep, but Henry watched the path, not the man. Shot 7 slid through the mist and struck just under the ribcage, sending the flanker tumbling into a drainage ditch. Target 8, final rifleman, 350 yards. Time 05:43:38. Movement fleeing downslope arc, FT/sec. Lead inches. Wind. Slight increase to 3-4 mph. Difficulty maximum. Henry steadied his trembling forearms. The cold was seizing him now, turning his hands into stiff, aching clamps. He clenched the stock harder, teeth grinding as a fresh wave of water seeped through his trousers. The last German sprinted across a steep downslope, silhouetted faintly against the pale gray horizon. This was the longest shot, 350 yards, nearly 2 football fields, and the most difficult: downward trajectory, shifting wind, and severe lateral velocity. But Henry did not see chaos, he saw currents. A drifting skiff pushed by wind and water. He found the keel line, aligned it with the man's motion, let his left eye draw the arc, let his right eye commit the shot. The trigger broke clean. A heartbeat later, the German stumbled, staggered, then fell, sliding several yards before coming to rest. Silence returned to the valley, and the ambush died with him. For a long moment, Henry simply lay in the culvert, breath shaking, hands numb, unable to feel his legs. He heard nothing but water dripping and his own ragged exhale. 5:45. The first convoy truck rumbled cautiously around the bend, headlights dimmed under blackout covers. The driver braked hard, stunned by the bodies scattered across the hillside. Pee Wee McAllister arrived moments later with a security team. He slid down the embankment, bar ready, eyes wide as he scanned the field. "Jesus, Stillwater," he whispered, "you did this alone." Henry pushed himself upright. His uniform was soaked through, teeth chattering violently, but his voice, when it finally emerged, was steady. Ambush needed breaking. Pee Wee stared at the hillside again, then back at Henry. "Breaking? Hell, Stillwater, you erased it." But the officers who arrived minutes later didn't share that awe. They examined the positions, muttered about fortunate timing, and suggested the Germans had panicked. No one asked how Henry landed 8 precision shots in under 60 seconds against moving targets at distances doctrine deemed unworkable. No one asked why his rifle was tilted when they found him. No one asked about the pencil mark on the scope housing. Recognition was not expected, not in this war, not for this kind of soldier. Henry simply nodded, shouldered his rifle, and limped back toward the convoy, quiet, cold, and exhausted. The culvert still rippled with the memory of his shots long after he left it behind. Dawn had barely settled over the Luxembourg hills when word of the broken ambush began to ripple through the 110th Infantry Regiment. Soldiers emerging from tents, shaking frost from their jackets, spoke in low tones as they passed steaming cups of weak coffee back and forth. They didn't know the details, not the angles, not the yards, not the strange riverbed technique used in a flooded culvert, but they knew one thing. A convoy had lived because a single private had fought the war his own way. By noon, the rumor had shape. 8 Germans, moving targets, didn't even get the gun fired. No support, no fire team, just Stillwater down in some hole. Here he was half frozen when they pulled him out. Pee Wee McAllister shut down the more fanciful versions with gruff certainty, but even he couldn't hide the admiration in his voice. "He ain't some superhero, he's just steady. Real damn steady." The enlisted men nodded, they understood steady. Steady got you home alive. None of them spoke to Henry about it directly. They respected him too much for that. Working-class men knew the weight of unacknowledged skill, the quiet pride held by carpenters, welders, millwrights, mechanics, men who built things without applause. Henry was one of them, just a different trade. A marksman shaped by rivers and drift lines. He didn't seek attention. He didn't explain the technique. He simply cleaned his rifle, rubbing oil into the metal with the same care he used on keel plates in the boatyard, and prepared for whatever the next day demanded. In the weeks that followed, something remarkable happened, though no officer ever traced the cause. The ambush that Henry dismantled had been one in a series of German attempts to cut American logistics lines. Before November 28th, convoy losses along Route 17 averaged 42%. Trucks destroyed, men killed or wounded, supplies burned. After Henry took over watch, ambush attempts dropped, convoys passed more safely. And more telling than the broad trend were the numbers attached to Henry himself. On the next 5 convoys he overwatched, not a single American died. Patrols he accompanied saw a 71% reduction in first contact casualties. His squad requested him by name when routes looked wrong. It wasn't magic, nor myth, nor luck. It was geometry and instinct, a craftsman applying principles of motion the Army had never studied. Some squads attempted to mimic his practice, swinging helmets from rope lines, kicking tin cans downhill, but without the internal math Henry carried from Stillwater's boatworks, they couldn't replicate the lead times, the angles, the intuitive corrections. To them, Henry's accuracy was a talent. To Henry, it was simply paying attention. Recognition, when it came, was as thin and brittle as the frost lining the Luxembourg grass. Lieutenant Gaines submitted the after-action report, describing the engagement as enemy ambush disrupted by advantageous terrain and timely fire from forward scout. No mention of the technique, no acknowledgement of the difficulty. No understanding of what had actually happened. Captain Delaney added a brief commendation. Private Henry James demonstrated initiative under limited visibility. A single line, no medal, no citation. Just a nod, half-hearted and ambiguous, as though initiative were a minor inconvenience rather than the saving of 24 men. Pee-wee fumed. That's it, he spat. Man breaks an ambush, saves the whole damn convoy, and they write him up like he fixed a flat tire. What? Henry only shrugged. Doesn't matter. It oughta, Pee-wee muttered, but Henry meant what he said. Recognition wasn't why he fought. It wasn't why he rewrote the firing principles of his trade. It wasn't why he endured the cold, the mud, or the crushing responsibility that came with being right when others weren't. He had a job, he did it, praise wouldn't change the river, and war, like rivers, had little use for pride. Days later, a German patrol discovered the bodies of the MG42 team Henry had eliminated. The attack site baffled them. The angles didn't align. The precision suggested at least a squad of U.S. sharpshooters. The Germans lifted helmets, examined bullet holes, measured trajectories. Ein Zug von Scharfschützen, one sergeant muttered, a platoon of marksmen. They assumed they had encountered a coordinated overwatch element, perhaps 8 to 10 riflemen firing from multiple angles. No single sniper could have produced such rapid, moving target eliminations. Their field report noted, American snipers appear to have developed new moving target doctrine. Recommend reduced lateral shifts under fire. German MG teams in the sector began spacing themselves farther apart. They used false ambush positions, dummy logs, empty sandbag nests to confuse American scouts. They reduced their mid-fight relocations, forcing their gun crews to remain static longer to avoid exposing movement. Henry had changed enemy tactics without ever knowing it. And still, no officer in the 110th Infantry Regiment understood what he had truly done. When the war finally staggered to its end in 1945, Henry was one of the men lucky enough to step back onto American soil with his body intact and his spirit unbroken. He returned home not with a chest full of medals, but with a single worn duffel bag and a folded letter from Pee-wee tucked between his socks. The train from Chicago rattled into Stillwater on a warm June morning. Henry stepped down onto the familiar platform, carrying the slow-breathing sense of a man who had seen too much motion and finally reached a place that did not move at all. His parents greeted him quietly, no parade, no brass band, just the warmth of two people grateful beyond words. Elias shook his hand longer than decorum demanded. His mother touched the side of his face as though confirming he was real. By late July, Henry was back at Gunderson Boatworks, hauling lumber, sanding hulls, tightening iron rivets with the same deliberate patience he had carried into the war. He never spoke of the Viking Eye-Line Trick. He never spoke of the 8 Germans on the hillside. He never described the cold water in the culvert, or the pencil mark on his scope, or the way a man's motion formed a line just clear enough to predict. Asked about the war, he said simply, it was work, hard work. Some nights he sat on the river